get her started here. There we are. Sorry about that. Slight delay. Anyway, thank you for having me here today. We're going to sort of, Mark Goodland and I are going to sort of tag team this presentation. And so I'm going to do my part. Then I'm going to basically pass the baton to Mark, and he's going to do the remaining part, and then we'll address whatever questions afterwards and those kinds of things. So we've been asked to come here today to talk to you about basically where we are with our quail restoration program here in the state. No surprise, I think, to anyone that's in the audience or any of the commissioners that that the trend in quail populations has been going downward, and it's been doing this for decades. If there's maybe a slight bright spot in there, is you'll see that the last 3 or 4 years, it seems to have somewhat leveled off in that downward trend. So what we have is an actual quail plan that has been developed by the agency in collaboration with lots and lots of agency staff and lots of time. And this plan is based on a larger plan, which is called the Northern Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. And it utilizes all of the elements that are outlined in a NBCI coordinated implementation plan. That implementation plan has 3 key elements, which are focal area, focal landscape, and focal region. We've also added, from the standpoint of our program, one additional component, which is called an anchor. And I'll explain that here in just a few moments. But the key element here is that sort of hierarchy of how we step down restoration to the landscape of this state. Also, there's monitoring, in other words, counting of quail that's built into this whole process, and that's part of that CIP, or Coordinated Implementation Program. This is a little diagram which shows you basically a focal area, which is that top element in the NBCI CIP process, and embedded in that is what we call an anchor. What an anchor is it's a publicly owned piece of property. Primarily, at present, it's a wildlife management area or refuge that the agency owns and already manages. And the purpose of that anchor is to provide a place for building up quail populations and allowing for quail to disperse into the surrounding area, which is the larger focus area part of that. And Mark's going to talk a little bit more about the focus area component of that. But the anchor is really important. And the reason it's important is because in order to get populations to move out and to occupy lots of lands that are in a larger focus area type arrangement, it's very difficult and it's very expensive to trap and to transplant quail. It's also not altogether successful in all situations. And so this type of process works really well, and we'll monitor it, we'll tweak it, we'll do whatever we need in the future. But by and large, this is a more cost-effective process, and it's one that doesn't require large amounts of manpower and money to go try to find sufficient amounts of quail. I mean, it can take literally thousands of quail to occupy a piece of real estate and to actually build up populations if we don't just allow sort of some way to facilitate improving habitat and allowing for natural dispersal. And the quail will do it, so that we're pretty confident. Bark Camp Barrens, shown here, is a good example of a nearby focus area with an anchor, and Bark Camp is the anchor, outlined in red. So those red borders are all various tracts of land that are owned by the agency and are part of the wildlife management area. And then surrounding that purple outlined area is what has been identified then as the larger focus area for that particular project. Some good important things to know about Bark Camp, which we're quite proud of, is that they've actually taken, Bark Camp personnel and the Region 2 staff have actually taken this area, which at present you can see has a lot of forested land and also has some open lands that are already part of that inside some of those red boundaries. They've taken that and they've done improvements. They've used prescribed fire. They've used gyrotrack machines. They've done various treatments to that. And also just within the last week or so, they've sold 169 acres of timber that will be cut on that area, and cutting that timber creates brand new quail habitat that didn't exist on Bark Camp before. And also, I think probably of interest to you is to know that that timber brings in the agency $144,000. So actually, that's my way of suggesting to you that we can actually make money off of making quail habitat in that fashion, at least using the timber management process. So these are the other quail focus areas. We have one in Region 1, Wolf River. We have one at Bridgestone Firestone Wildlife Management Area in Region 3, and also Lick Creek Bottoms, which is out in Region 4. Those are our 4 current focus areas that we're working with, and we have the anchor WMAs and those focus areas that surround those tracks. Kiker Bottoms Refuge, additionally, which is also located in Region 4, provides a really good example of quail habitat which really produces. In other words, the type of thing that we need to strive for in maximizing quail production on a piece of land. And Kiker has about 250 acres that really can be managed for quail. And right now, an approximate estimate from the manager there is that it's got about a quail per 2.5 acres, which essentially equates to a covey per 25 acres. And covey per 25 acres in this part of the world is really not bad at all. It's a pretty good density. You normally might expect more like a covey per 40 acres. So it's a good density. On the other hand, you have areas like shown here, and showing Hickory Flats, and not picking on Hickory Flats because it's a very different kind of environment. But it's a good example of a habitat that we have a lot of in this state. A lot of dense canopy forest. There's very little on the ground in there except dirt and sticks and leaves, but there's very little growing. So the forest is not reproducing itself. There's no low shrubby cover. There are no grasses, weeds, and other plants that are needed for quail habitat because it's too dense. And so with these timber treatments that we can do, we can open that up and make things start to grow really well on the ground in an environment like that and start to make it become quail habitat. And on our wildlife areas, that also means that we get some greenbacks back from that process. So typical tools that we use in this program are, first of all, removing saplings. So, you see this big stand of saplings here that's growing up in a field right next to a big tract of woods, and that's not quail habitat. They're just not going to be able to use that. They'll use the edge of it maybe, but that doesn't produce very many quail. What you want to do is make quail use all of that habitat that's there. So if you don't remove those saplings are on their way after a time to being closed canopy forest, just like you see in the background of that slide. So what we do is we remove those saplings. We get those cleared right out of there. And one of the nice tools that we have to do that's a machine called gyrotrack, which you see there on the right. Those things can grind up, depending on the kind of head that is purchased to put on the front of those machines, they can grind up some pretty large trees. And what they do is they just basically turn them into wood mulch. The other thing we use a lot of is prescribed fire. So we burn a lot of acres, and of course forest harvesting. So you can see some example. Another example there is some forest timber harvesting. Not necessarily quite ready for quail, but it can get there after some amount of time. The other important thing is the knowledge base that we have. Quail are often referred to as the most studied game bird we have in the country. And that's definitely indisputable. If you take all of the information we know currently on quail and just put it in a big stack, it'll go from the floor almost to the top of this podium. And I can attest to that because I physically have done that. It's that large. But the problem with that is much of it is pretty old. The most recent that we have here in Tennessee really was done in the 1990s. So Ralph Dimmick from the University of Tennessee did quail research here for several decades, and his last work was in the 1990s, and there hasn't been really very much since that time. And so we need new information because the land of this state is different than it was in the 1990s, even though that seems to most of us like not long ago. So we need newer information to base our management. And to that, the last little point I have here to make that's important before I go ahead and pass the baton to Mark to complete this presentation is that Tennessee has the privilege in 2 years, 2017, of being co-host with the University of Tennessee and the Northern Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, the big deal event of the NBTC, National Bobwhite Technical Committee, and joint 8th National Quail Symposium. And so that's going to be in Knoxville. We're actually starting the planning. We've had some meetings and we've had folks working in the background, starting the planning for that meeting. Even though it's 2 years away, it takes a long time to put on a good show. But the importance of that meeting is that that's where a lot of, the quail biologists of 22 states covered by the NBCI get together and they discuss what are the next things we need to do to make this work. And it's also where all of the researchers from universities far and wide come and they present the latest information to us so we learn about what's out there as far as new technology to do our job. And so it's a really big, important process for us. So you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, as time goes on. So if I may, I'll pass the baton to Mark and he'll complete this presentation. He's out of the way.
Ooh. Okay. Comprising over 90% of Tennessee, private lands are going to have to play an important role in any kind of bobwhite recovery. Contrary to a lot of other states, we have really limited opportunities on our wildlife management areas. About 86% of our WMAs consists of forest land, another 7% of woodlands, and so even some of our focused WMAs end up being a little bit small. So it's hard for us to have these large areas like some other states do on public lands, and so it's going to take a combination of that public and private lands efforts in order to make a difference for quail in these focus areas. And unfortunately, what's happened over time is a lot more of our private lands landscape looks like what you see in this picture here. A lot of intensive, clean farming, increased urbanization, and heavily manicured landscape, which basically is unfriendly to bobwhites. In order to address the private land situation, the agency has 4 wildlife habitat biologists that are cost shared with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and are located in their 4 area offices across the state. TWRA and NRCS also cost share with Quail Forever, 3 Quail Forever biologists. As you can see, 2 of them here are located in West Tennessee, where the majority of our Conservation Reserve Program lands are. And we have another one over on the plateau where we have a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that heavily focuses on bobwhite, quail, and shortleaf pine restoration. Right now we do have a vacancy in the East Tennessee TWRA position, and the plateau Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist position. We'll be trying to fill those as soon as we can. Here's a picture of our proposed Wolf River focus area, and as Roger explained, together you have the anchor WMA and you have the private land section that together make the Quail focus area. And as you saw on the Bar Camp Barrens area, the private lands area completely surrounded it. We were a little bit limited here near Wolf River with the Mississippi state line to the south, and to the north and east having a lot of forested wetlands. And so Wolf River Quail focus areas are our smallest private lands portion, about 5,000 acres, and it ranges up to 17,000 acres on the Lick Creek Bottoms area in Greene County. Our approach on working with the private lands focus area is to be really proactive, and once we kick this off, that we're going to be proactively contacting landowners, and we will work with U.S. Department of Agriculture and UT Extension, try to team up with Quail Forever chapters, and send letters to landowners that are located within the focus areas, invite them to a meeting, explain to them what we're trying to achieve with our Quail focus area, the benefits of participating in it to them, and again, try to gauge that landowner interest within those focus areas. We have been working with USDA for a long time, and we try to continually look at the USDA conservation programs and tweak them to be beneficial for wildlife as much as possible and for bobwhites as much as possible, and we'll be advising the landowners on what opportunities that they have. And we won't be doing things just for bobwhite. We'll be looking to put good conservation on the ground with any landowner that's interested in, because often it can be tweaked to provide benefits for bobwhites. Be seeking again those local partnerships in the Quail Forever chapters, and I see quite a few members here today. That's great. Quail Forever has been fantastic partners. They've not only provided manpower on projects, they've helped provide money to support the farm bill biologist positions, and have provided supplies and funding for habitat projects on our Quail focus areas and other WMAs too over the years. And another way that they help out a lot of times is helping fund workshops that we invite landowners to, or are helping to train agency personnel on, again, managing for land for wildlife, including bobwhites. So what are the advantages to a landowner of being within a Quail focus area? First of all, we will be trying to put these people to the top of the list as providing them technical assistance priorities as we get requests. We've worked, one example, when working with the USDA programs and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, applications, and where the landowner is going to be doing a significant amount of work that would benefit bobwhites, trying to get them enough ranking points in the system that they would be have a greater chance of getting their application funded. Except for the Bridgestone-Firestone area, the other Quail focus areas are in counties that are eligible for the Conservation Reserve programs, what we call the SAFE, or State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement Bobwhite Habitat Practice. It's our premier quail practice within the Conservation Reserve program that also provides about the best financial incentives to the landowners. And that practice is open for enrollment on a continuous basis. The agency also has a small farm wildlife habitat program that our wildlife biologists use to try to fill in the gaps where the USDA programs and funding don't work, and so we're going to try to focus those funds within the Quail focus areas. And we've also increased the normal cap of 2,000 acres or $2,000 per contract to $4,000 for those landowners that are located within the Quail focus areas. And we work on promotional items. One, commissioners, you saw one of the hats that the landowners will see that cooperate within these focus areas. And we also have, we'll have signs that they can post should they desire. As with the anchor areas, we're doing spring call counts on the private lands portions of the areas. The WMAs started their call counts 2014, and this last spring was the first year of the bobwhite call counts. And during the next 5 years, we should be able to determine trends and also bobwhite population densities from these call counts. I feel like we've made some significant progress in the last 2 years since the release of our our quail plan, as Roger mentioned before, is the Kiker Bottoms Refuge, which served as a great example and not only to landowners, but within the agency of what kind of success we can have on really a relatively small amount of area when we're talking about doing things landscape for quail. Kiker Bottoms is 525 acres in Blount County, and a little over half of that really is only suitable quail habitat, as there's a lot of wetland on that area too. And to have that kind of population response from the significant changes that Bill Smith and company have made over there has been very notable and inspiring to the area managers on our other quail focus anchor areas. And Roger mentioned pretty much a lot of those things that we're already doing on the anchor WMAs. We're trying to just kick up, make new areas that are previously in forest land or invasive vegetation that aren't good quail habitat, recover it to the fullest, and step up the use of prescribed burning and disking. Within our quail focus areas, we have the boundaries identified as far as what we think are going to be the final boundaries. Had the 1 year of the call counts, and we're in the final stages of trying to prepare to kick off. I do want to acknowledge we've had a little bit of a setback from the change of my role from Assistant Chief of Habitat to the Chief, and with the 2 vacancies that we have in the field biologist positions. But again, we're striving to kick this off, and the timing may vary a little bit from one quail focus area to the next, but we will be moving forth with that in the near future. And as they could, our field biologists have already been trying to contact, and some of them have worked with several landowners within the quail focus areas, developing habitat management plans for them. Our goal overall, where we're trying to go, is within 5 to 10 years, hopefully closer to the 5-year point, is to get 25% of the land base in usable quail habitat. And that's what in the National Bobwhite Recovery Plan has been identified as what really needs to occur in order to keep quail secure on the landscape, and that's what we're shooting for. We do realize that in order to make an effect statewide, there are other conservation arenas that we need to work in outside the targeted focus areas. In 2006, the agency helped initiate and has provided support for the Center for Native Grasslands Management. Through a lot of the great research that they've done, they've been able to show that properly grazing, mixture of native warm season grasses, not only provides some benefits to wildlife, but if the landowners are doing this during the warm summers of the month when the cool season forages are in more of a dormant stage, that they can actually put some really good money in their pocket by doing this. And it's been very active in holding workshops through UT Extension and providing the information to them and other state and federal agencies, as well as livestock producers and other landowners. They have a good realm of publications, not only on the native grasses, but also on oak savanna management. And they've had several research projects they've been involved in, some including bobwhite quail and grassland songbirds, also on the use and benefits of prescribed fire, and also on oak savanna management. Heavily due to efforts of the Center for Native Grasslands Management, the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative is also located at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And as Roger mentioned, the NBCI has been important in getting the states working together to get a national bobwhite recovery plan and setting the standards. One of the things that we, as quail biologists, dealt with is that each state was doing things differently and trying to pool data together. It just didn't fit. So now we have a standardized approach to do this, and one of the benefits is being able to pool data and tell more meaningful results from that data that we're gathering. NBCI has been important in working, again, with USDA programs. They were heavily responsible for the CP33 bobwhite buffers practice and the recent expansion of that practice to include the irrigation center pivot corners, along with promoting the safe practices being offered to the states to craft what they think is their best management practice for certain species, and we chose to do ours for the bobwhite quail. They've also forged relationships with many other federal partners, one of them being the National Park Service. The Pea Ridge National Battlefield in Arkansas is actually going to be the first Park Service lands that will be an official NBCI focus area. And NBCI is also having conversations with National Park Service lands in Tennessee to see if they can make improvements. And one of the angles that they're coming on from Park Service lands is not only habitat that benefits wildlife, but mainly it's habitat that was historical at that time in our history that they are trying to represent on these Park Service lands. And because of the NBCI's efforts, along with the center, the Shortleaf Pine Initiative is also located at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And then the Shortleaf Pine Initiative is promoting the restoration and management of shortleaf pine and pine hardwood ecosystems, which managed properly provide great habitat for bobwhites. Because of the success we've had with our wildlife habitat biologists working with individual landowners, successes that we've seen in quail focus areas on other states, and all the partnerships and funding that are being brought to the table to benefit bobwhites, we feel strongly that there's real good chance and hope for success. And as bobwhite quail are sort of a sentinel for a host of other declining wildlife species, many of them birds, and also because that habitat benefits a lot of common game species like rabbits and deer and turkey, we feel that this isn't all just focused and benefited for quail. You know, there's just a wide realm of wildlife benefits that we get from these efforts. Partnerships are just extremely important. With that, I'd like to recognize some of the partners that we have here today. If you don't mind standing up while I introduce you to John Rissler, who's the Assistant State Conservationist for NRCS over the conservation programs. Andy Edwards, a regional representative for Quail Forever. And Andy and of course Ron Crabtree, everybody knows, represents Quail Forever at most of the commission meetings, and again the many chapter members that we have here, and again you all are just great partners in many ways and are essential to making these things happen. And we have Don McKenzie, who's the director of the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, and Dr. Pat Kaiser, who's the director of the Center of Native Grasslands Management. And lastly, I want to recognize that the essential partners in making this happen are going to be landowners and hunters. They're the ones that are going to be the ones to pass the word to the landowners that they know and people that they know, get the excitement, keep that going on bobwhites, and will be an integral part in all these efforts. And due to the forecast for continued increasingly rapid urbanization, we really feel that this is our last best chance to make a concerted, unified effort to restore bobwhites and maintain sustainable and huntable populations of bobwhites on our landscape so that we can ensure for future generations that they can enjoy the call and feel the thrill of the covey flush of this iconic game bird, Tennessee state game bird. See, there you go. We'll do it one more time, and you got a 3 covey flush day. So with that, Roger and I and any of our partners will be willing to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Chief Guttle. I'm sure there will be some questions. I'm going to start off with one. You made the comment that your goal was in 5 to 10 years to have 25% of your land more conducive quail habitat. Are you referring to just WMAs or just overall all public land?
We'll push for as much as we can on the WMAs, the private lands, you know, as a whole within the quail focus area to reach that level.
Who's making the decisions on our WMAs of these timber forests that are poor habitat? Who's making those decisions to go ahead and cut those?
Those are made together with the regions and the division, you know,
Are we just talking about the 4 anchor areas or WMAs, or are we talking about all our WMAs?
Well, we have forestry operations on, of course, our largest WMAs that we own the timber outright, and then we have 12, about a dozen foresters, and our Brian Chandler is our forestry coordinator, and they work with the regions to identify. Again, the main goal is not to just cut timber to make money. what we want to do is we need better wildlife habitat here. And the forestry management is the tool to get there. Getting money from it is a side benefit, so that's a mutual decision that occurs between the regions and the Wildlife and Forestry Division.
Sometimes I think that we have problems educating the public what cutting timber does for habitat.
That is education's a
Every
continual
time
battle.
you see a clear cut or maybe even selective cut, people are just moaning and groaning, and they don't realize what it does. So I think part of what we need to do is educate the public of why we're doing it, and I'm sure y'all are very well abreast of that. What other questions from the commission do we have?
I got a question. If we got has the agency put out an article or a brochure that we could give to the public? Like we were talking about prescribed burning earlier. I myself don't know exactly when would be the best time of the year on my own farm to do prescribed burning for quail habitat. Is there a time? I mean, if we had a layman's guide for habitat, I'm not saying it doesn't have to be real thick. If it's just real simple, and what things could the common landowner do to his property to help? I think it would help the public to know what they could do.
Yeah, there's some more educational tools. It's little when you ask about, when's the best time to do it. Prescribed burning is a tool that you really need to look at what your goal is. You can be burning forest land, you can be burning grassland, and depending on what your goal is may make a difference on whether it's best to do a late winter burn or an early fall burn, those sorts of things. So that's another reason why we have our wildlife habitat biologists, so they can work with the landowner, explain that. We also there's a lot of information on, we have the Tennessee Prescribed Fire Council, and they have a website, www.tnpfc.org, and there's information there, but of course there's a lot of more opportunities that we have to get that information out as we can.
Mark, we've got a prescribed fire little unique page color brochure coming out here probably in January through the Center for Native Grasslands Management, focused on burning native grasses, but that's a tool that'll be available probably in January.
Maybe that's something we ought to talk about putting in our magazine.
I've got 2 fields at home, it's about 50 acres of native warm season grass that I pasture. And I burn them off February, March, whenever I catch a dry time right there.
And as you know, the Prescribed Fire Act was passed in April of 2012, and since then, the Division of Forestry has a certified burn manager program that's open to the public, and we encourage people that, since prescribed burning has its liabilities potential, you don't want to just go out there and throw match. You need to know what you're doing. And so we more and more we are getting private landowners come through that and get certified to safely prescribe burn, and they have, once the landowner does that, and if they're doing things under an approved plan, then they have a lot more liability protection. That's one of the benefits of why we push to get that act passed.